welcome back to Riley's Rundowns. This is video 3 of the parts of Unit 5 of APUS History. This video will focus on the aftermath of the Civil War, which is called the Reconstruction. So after the Civil War, the South was really torn apart. All of their infrastructure was destroyed, and the top 10% of the wealthiest and most powerful people in the South lost 90% of their wealth and power. The questions during the Reconstruction are: how should the South be readmitted into the Union, and should the leaders of the South be punished? So the radical Republicans, including Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, wanted harsh punishments for the South and its leaders. So they created the Wade-Davis Bill in 1864, which said that the majority of the white males must pledge allegiance and abolish slavery in their state constitutions and disfranchise the Confederate leaders. The Wade-Davis Bill also required that 50% of the state's voters take the oath of allegiance to the Union. Lastly, it demanded stronger safeguards for the Emancipation Proclamation that one Lincoln was originally asking for in his idea. Lincoln pocket vetoed this bill, which was claimed as an abuse of his executive power. Lincoln also had a plan which was called the 10% Reconstruction Plan, which he created in 1863. This was more favorable than the radical Republicans' plan, as 10% of voters in the 1860 election had to take an oath of loyalty to the U.S., and the former higher-ranking Confederate leaders were excluded from the pardon. Johnson created a plan in 1865. This was more similar to Lincoln's plan, and this angered the radical Republicans who viewed Johnson as a spy. Johnson's plan would pardon all of the people who took an oath of allegiance, besides the wealthy Confederates. Johnson's plan also called for state conventions that would have to repeal the secession orders and would also have to ban slavery by ratifying the 13th Amendment. Next, we have radical Reconstruction. By the end of 1865, all of these seceded states met the requirements of Lincoln or Johnson's plans. Johnson implemented his plan when Congress wasn't in session. Along with this, angered radicals would not let Southern Republicans sit in Congress. This led to a radical plan which pushed for expansion of the freedmen's rights. We also have the Southern government, which implemented black codes. These were harsh laws for black people that would prevent them from having certain liberties. Eventually, many Southern states did end up electing high-ranking Confederates to Congress, which would upset a lot of people. For instance, Alexander Stephens, who was the former vice president of the Confederacy, became the Georgia senator in 1866. Moving on, we have some rights and acts of the time. We have the 13th Amendment, which was passed in 1865 and abolished slavery. We also have the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which was vetoed by Johnson, and then it was overridden by Congress, and this gave citizenship to freedmen and defined their liberties. This also was guaranteed by the 14th Amendment, which was passed in 1868 and guaranteed citizenship to all people born in the United States and guaranteed certain privileges and immunities. We also have the Tenure of Office Act of 1867, which would eventually lead to Johnson being impeached. We also have Congressional Reconstruction, which occurred in 1867 with the Reconstruction Act. Tennessee was the first state to be readmitted into Congress. The rest of the South was divided into 5 military districts. Congress had to approve all of the new state constitutions, and states had to ratify the 14th Amendment to re-enter the Union. Next, we have Johnson. When he was impeached in 1868, he violated the Tenure of Office Act. The Tenure of Office Act basically just said that the president had to get the consent of Senate before he could remove his cabinet members. He was impeached, but he was not removed from office. We also have the 15th Amendment, which was passed in 1870. This said that suffrage could not be denied based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. We also have the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which said that private businesses could not discriminate. Next, we move on to the idea of the lost cause. This was when people would look fondly at the South as it was when it was pre-Civil War. This promoted Southern nationalism. Leaders were revered, and many whites wanted to preserve this culture and their way of life in the South. We also have the Freedmen's Bureau, which was created in 1865. They provided food, education, and assistance to former slaves and poor whites. Their biggest success was in education. Next, we move on to African Americans in politics. So the African Americans made up the voting majority in South Carolina, Missouri, Louisiana, Alabama, and Florida. The Republicans really benefited from this. There were also a few congressmen who were Black during this time. So we have Hiram Rhodes Revel, who was the first Black senator, and Joseph Rainey, who was the first Black person in the House of Representatives. Key terms that you should know at the time are scalawags and carpetbaggers. Scalawags were Southerners who favored the Republicans, mostly for economic reasons, and carpetbaggers were Northerners who moved to the South during the Reconstruction, and they would mostly become doctors, lawyers, and teachers there. Sharecropping also came about at this time, which was the renting of land and paying via crops. This usually led to debt from the borrowers and would cause circular debts. Next, we have the Grant administration. So we have Seward's Folly in 1867, which was when William Seward purchased Alaska from Russia. Many people saw this as a mistake, but it later would be helpful because of the oil reserves. Most of Grant's administration was involved with a lot of scandal and corruption. Grant regularly used the spoils system, so eventually that would become known as Grantism. The Republican Party actually split up in the 1872 election because of Grantism. In the end, Grant served 2 terms from 1869 to 1877. So we also have the Panic of 1873, which was the worst depression of the century to that point. This began over investments in railroads. Debtors favored printing money, which led to a lot of money in supply, which led to a lot of inflation, which led to it being easier to pay off debts. We also have some ways that the Reconstruction was abandoned. So we have the KKK, or the Ku Klux Klan, which was a terrorist organization that used to intimidate and prevent Blacks from voting. Thousands were killed in 1865 to 1871. We also have the Enforcement Acts that were created in response to the KKK in 1870 and 1871. This was where the federal government could prosecute criminals of federal law, and the president could use the military to protect individual rights. We also have the Red Shirts and White League, which was a paramilitary white supremacist group who forced whites to join the Democratic Party and monitored elections, and they also intimidated Blacks from voting. We also have the Compromise of 1877, which was Hayes, who was a Republican, versus Tilden, who was a Democrat. Tilden needed 1 more electoral vote, but 20 were disputed, and they all went to Hayes. The importance of this compromise was that it marked the end of the Reconstruction. Next, we have the New South. So by 1878, all the southern states had been redeemed by the Democrats. Industrialization in the South was slow at first, but eventually it began to speed up, and a lot of railroads increased in the 1880s, and they used the same gauge size as the North. There were also a lot of factories, especially textile factories, and many factories refused African American workers. If African American workers were allowed into factories, they would be paid lower wages and be given the harsher jobs. We also have Booker T. Washington, who was a former slave and advocated for Blacks to get an education in vocational training specifically. We also have Plessy v. Ferguson, which occurred in 1896, which declared that Blacks were separate but equal. We also have the Atlantic Compromise, which occurred in 1895, where Booker T and other African American leaders made an agreement with Southern white people that said that African Americans would not challenge segregation as long as they had unimpeded economic opportunities. Lastly, we have some methods of segregation that were used at the time for African Americans. So we had the poll tax, which was a tax that was required for them to vote. We also have the literacy test, which was a literacy test that was required for African Americans to pass, and usually those African Americans would be given harder versions of the literacy tests. We also have the grandfather clause, which said that the poll tax and literacy tests were not required if your ancestors were able to vote in the 1860 election, which kind of set African Americans up for failure because African Americans were not allowed to vote in the 1860 election. We also have the Jim Crow laws, which was a legal segregation in the South and was upheld by Plessy v. Ferguson. We also have lynching, which was increased drastically in the 1890s, and Ida B. Wells was a journalist who specifically spoke out against lynchings.